follow through with where our introduction. So my name is Pelc, pronouns she, her, hers. I'm coming to you from Indianapolis, and I would just like to acknowledge that I am on the traditional homelands of Native peoples, specifically the Miami, Potawatomi, and the Shawnee, among others. So we'd just like to pay respect to elders, both past and present. I am a counseling psychologist by training, and I am hopeful that we have a diverse representation of folks on this group. I am currently an assistant professor at Marian University. So I teach undergraduate, graduate students. I do quite a bit of advising, consulting around ethics, and I do quite a bit of work around curriculum development. I identify as a cisgender Puerto Rican woman who passes as white in the US and am a heritage Spanish speaker. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Swazo.
Well, thank you, Dr. Pelc, and thank you all for joining this session. It's a pleasure, as I said, as Dr. Pelc said, to be here and to share some thoughts with you, some ideas. We're really excited about this topic. My name is Roberto Swazo. Also a professor at University of Northern Iowa, and also an adjunct faculty here at Antioch, as well in the counselor education program, which I'm enjoying very much. By training, counselor educator, licensed school counselor. So my practice has been school counseling field, also a little bit in mental health, but primarily in the school counseling area. Areas of expertise too, it's psycholinguistics or bilingual interventions, and this is part of the genesis of this presentation. So thank you, Dr. Pelc.
Great. I can go ahead and share our PowerPoint screen. If you can just, in the chat, just let us know, yes, it looks okay, so we can confirm that we're all on the same page here. We would so appreciate that. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Andy. I really appreciate it. Okay, we'll go ahead and continue here then. I'll go ahead and add the book link, Dr. Swazo. If you want to talk a little bit about our origins, I feel like you generally do a better job than I do.
Sure. So the genesis of the book actually came as a result of conversation that Dr. Pelc and I coincided in Spain one time, and we had some ideas on how to take a previous work that I had completed, a previous book that I have completed on bilingual interventions and teaching basic Spanish for non-native speakers. And so we came up with this idea on how to utilize narrative therapy and also existential principles and integrate it with bilingual clients. So primarily, with the idea that we could target individual families and groups, but in a very concise way. So we decided to embark on this project. So we're very excited. The book was just released this past September, just a few weeks ago, actually, just was released in the market. And the book, the way the book is constructed, it has multiple sections on relationships, and I'm reading right off the book right here on trust, criticism, forgiveness, humility, self-compassion, identity, intersectionalities, change and coping, distress, tolerance, courage, health, death and grief, adversity, future, inspiration, motivation, mindfulness, reflection and wellness, self-realization, hope, peace, among others. And so the way we have it is that we created microfictions, really short stories, and then we have questions to process that, creative activities, and also we have quotes that we dissect into questions and activities, and also sayings that might be related to the Latinx culture from Spain to Latin America all the way. And then so we dissect them and use kind of creative exercises that are not just written exercises, but a little bit of art therapy and activities and music therapy as well, integrated in those activities. So more or less that's kind of the spirit of the book. I don't know if Dr. Pelc want to share anything else.
No, that sounds excellent. Thank you for helping to frame that for us. I put the link in the chat in case folks would like to read a little bit more. If you're somebody like me who likes to be able to click around and explore, see things for myself, it is accessible to you, and happy to repost if that would be helpful. It was also a secondary guide if you would like to maybe speak to this as a resource as well.
Right, so this was the first book, and then using this book as a base, then we decided to embark into the next project. So this is kind of the base in which provides some basic Spanish for non-native speakers. And then the other book, which is a new one, has the interventions attached to it. So one is kind of a connection to the other. So.
Excellent. Thank you. And Emily, that's a great point. If this link doesn't work, I'm happy to follow up with another one as well. So we were thinking about how to spend our time together today, and we were thinking, oh gosh, 50 minutes. There is so much we would love to explore with you, and so much that I'm sure you could share with us, and we certainly welcome that. If there are any dimensions, the kind of work that you do, the spaces that you're in, what your primary day or evening roles are, feel free to post them in the chat. We would love to know a little bit more about who is here with us together. But in terms of our time for today, our hope is really to take an opportunity to talk about stories, to talk about cuentos and dichos, and how language can be such a powerful way to process emotionally laden themes. So that's really what we're hoping to do today. And in order to help set some of the framework, we'll talk with you a little bit about narrative theory, existential theory, how those two then we layered with liberation theory in order to help us conceptualize how to use these tools. So we're trying to be intentional in our movement here.
Thank you. Yes, so some of the framework, as Dr. Pelc mentioned, is based on narrative therapy and existential theories. In essence, we don't go a lot in terms of, all the mechanics of narrative therapy or existential theories. But what we intended to do was to have a foundation for the book that was applicable across cultures. We didn't want to use a theory or theories or foundations that were not applicable specifically to the Latinx culture. So we wanted to have something that had universal topics, so to speak, that would speak to anyone from any culture, that could have been moldable, that we could take into any direction without utilizing any kind of colonial systems or anything that could be misconstrued as oppressive. So we decided to utilize narrative therapy and existential theory or therapy because of how open they are and based on humanistic principles that are very moldable and applicable to anyone. So in essence, we use, as Dr. Pelc mentioned, the idea of conversation as an art, the client being the author of, their lives, and they know better than we do how to externalize the problem, using the stories and recreating the stories, deconstructing the stories to empower the clients in rewriting the stories and their narratives and take them in a different direction. Putting everything in a cultural context was very critical for us, and how to contextualize that using constructivistic principles as well. Also, we like the idea of analyzing the characters in the microfictions and how to dissect those characters and how to position the client into the story so that they can use some kind of projective ideas and then how to view themselves in that process as well. As far as the existential theories or foundations, what we decided to use was to apply a lot of Socratic questions. that would take the client to the next level, so to speak. So why I'm here, the purpose of my life, the meaning of my life, how can I take suffering in life and take it into, give it a spin and then create meaning out of it. And, the idea of being alone and yet being connected. These are topics that apply to anyone. And I think what it was powerful for us, it was to understand that stories apply to any culture. They're applicable to any culture. And yet, in the Latinx culture, we use a lot of stories. We tell stories all the time. We explain everything through stories. And that's how we decided to take the project in that direction. So liberation theories.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Swazo. And so when we're thinking about that framework and how to utilize stories, but specifically stories that are embedded in race and gendered settings, in complex sociocultural settings, that our hope is, and we talk about clients, but it could also be students, it could be supervisees, it could be so many folks with whom you might work and or interact, that you could be utilizing these tools with. It's the consideration of voices that are so often lost. So refocusing the center of voices, identities, histories, parts of self that are so often marginalized in dominant narratives, underrepresented in images, educational materials, through colonization by dominant groups. And so reclaiming parts of self that have been lost, marginalized, or uncovered through the use of stories and language, which tend to be much more culturally inclusive, more culturally humble, and allow a space for folks to write, to re-author, to share in ways that feel congruent and consistent with their own wishes, desires, identities. Go ahead, Dr. Swazo.
So one of the elements that, as I mentioned before, we wanted to underscore was the idea of language attached and what language conveys. And so the idea of the construction of reality and that unique experience is very constructivistic. So we decided to incorporate that in the project. And of course, how the language, the vehicle that we utilize connects emotions in a different way. For those of us who are bilingual or multilingual, you know what I mean with this. This is a basic concept of psycholinguistics. We have, in our brain certain, I guess, areas that we hold certain emotions, and they're connected to certain languages. So when we construct these microfictions and these quotes and sayings and things of that nature, we have it in both languages in such a way that even for clients who are bilingual may see something in one language and then something in another language, and that expands that consciousness, so to speak, in terms of that reality. And another piece that I think it's important to mention is that even though the manual, the book, is intended to be utilized, as Dr. Pelc mentioned, with could be supervisors, it could be with in groups, in families, and whatnot. But actually, by itself, can be utilized by English speakers too, even ignoring the Spanish piece, because it has those universal themes as well. So we wanted to have it to be pertinent to both populations, English speaking and then also Spanish speaking as well. So.
Go ahead, Dr. Swazo.
All right.
All right.
Sure, sounds good. So when we, and some of you might be familiar about this, the difference between microfictions and short stories is that in a microfiction, you have everything that you want to say in a couple of paragraphs, so to speak, in one page. and you have, it's like a really condensed story that doesn't have to be, you have to go through the evolution of a climax and all that, and then the conclusion. Also, the way we created the microfictions is that sometimes they're open-ended, and to the point that it obligates the reader to come up with an ending. Also, some of the questions related to the microfictions are related to kind of recreating the beginning. What if you could change the beginning? What if you could change the middle point? What if you can change the end of it? In such a way that it obligates the individual to really recreate things and rewrite things mentally in order to create meaning. So it's that projection piece that we were talking about, indicating that, you know, we own our stories. You know, we are the owners of our stories. So like that, we have the connection. So if there's a theme, for example, of hope, so we have a microfiction related to hope, and then we have quotes that are related to hope as well. So these are pieces of of wisdom that adds another dimension to windows of our realities. And the same thing with the sayings. You know, in our cultures, we have a lot of sayings, you know, that we inherit from our ancestors, and then we pass them down through oral history. So we use a lot of those who were of, let's say, Hispanic, you know, Spanish origin, Latinx origin, Latin American origin, and also from across the board, you know, of multiple cultures as well. So those sayings really also speak to the client in a different way. So we wanted to enhance one topic and target the microfictions, the quotes, and the sayings to have the entire picture in terms of that particular theme that we were trying to address. Dr. Pelc?
Yes, yes. And one of the, we have a couple of different points of consideration in our time together today, and also as we consider utilizing these interventions and these tools. For example, the context of culture, when we read so many books that describe cultures as a monolith, there are these broad generalizations that we would like to be able to, and we often offer reminders to consider a stance of cultural humility, a stance of not knowing, again, of repositioning the client or supervisee or student or group members in the expert role of their lives, acknowledging power differentials in the stories and in the processing of these stories. And allow folks to define themselves as they wish to project themselves into the stories in ways that feel consistent with their own identities, and to frame their own life stories. So the tools that we have, the processing questions and activities, are starting points, and you'll see that shortly. We're going to invite you to reflect on some micro fictions and some processing questions, and invite you to utilize these as starting points, that they can be modified in any way. It's really just an opportunity to begin a conversation. And so as we think about the conversations, we think about switching from Spanish to English and vice versa. We have to acknowledge the gender piece of pronouns and consideration of language. And so throughout, we used gender pronouns that are originally designated by the story and or by language. However, we encourage folks to adapt these gender pronouns, to adapt the language that's utilized, to encourage fluidity and flexibility and inclusivity, such that we don't leave important pieces of identity behind, and that we don't use language in ways that are harmful. So this is constantly at the top of mind when doing translations back and forth and when having these conversations. Similarly around age, so thinking about stories, how we might modify stories or encourage the processing of stories according to developmental stage and age, according to the content of the exercise. That maybe we talk about grief differently with children than we do with folks who are older. The experience of grief and loss might be different across the lifespan. But similarly, we're going to go through an example with you, and we are going to encourage the group. And some of this where we're gathering as we're doing this with you, we'd love to hear how you might utilize these tools. in individual sessions, in group sessions, in family counseling sessions, that they can be concentrated to a single individual or relational unit, a broad context, a whole school system, a whole community, to make it relevant to the needs and the lives of our clients. So just some considerations that we don't have to be locked into the examples that we have necessarily. We invite your creativity and certainly welcome it. So as we're thinking about perhaps the work that you do, whatever that might look like, or whatever stage you're in, we might encourage you to think about with the folks where you work, or perhaps your own identity development, as we dissect our own stories and our own internalized messages, what dimensions of culture or self, intersecting identities, internalized messages, do you sometimes wish you could explore further in the work that you do? And so what pieces of self do you feel like are lost in the work that you do together? Sometimes these themes are tied to racism, ableism, colorism, homophobia, transphobia, stories of starting over, stories of holding more than one thing, grief in moving and starting over, and yet hope and excitement for the future. What it's like to walk multiple lines, right? Those borderlands, holding a bicultural, multicultural identity. So many themes that stories allow us to step into. So if you might be, as we're moving along, reflecting for yourself, what themes on these stories do you wish to explore further? Again, in your own work or for yourself. That would help us meet some of the inspiration, the vision of the work that we have here. So I'll go ahead and Dr. Swazo, if you'd like, I'll share the microfiction so the group can read along with you, and let me know if that works okay for us. Okay, how does that look, folks?
Looks good. Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful.
So this is one example of a microfiction. This one is not contained in the book, but it's one that we developed after as well, just to give you an idea on how to apply it. So let's kind of read it. So my parents always say that we're all equal and that all the children are the same. I always have believed it, and I know that they love me unconditionally. Despite their categorical love and support for me, I have learned to question the concept of equality. For instance, one day when my siblings and I were taking a bath together, I distinctively noticed how pale their skin was, while mine was of dark bronze color. Their hair was very thin, with a combination of light brown with yellow highlights, and mine was thick. See, I lost my pale and light, was thick and of a black charcoal color. My siblings looked like mom and dad, while I looked very different. One day in the history class, while I talking about the native indigenous people of Central and South America, one of my classmates posted a question to the class which caused a cognitive dissonance in my head. He said, "Hey, look at your family members in this picture. Why don't you go back home?" The class erupted in a brutal collective laughter that I felt deep in my soul. I sprang out of my chair and left the classroom like a flash. I do not know if I was mortified by the comment or simply struck by a hidden truth that my parents had held for a long time. Yes, I'm adopted. I look like the native indigenous people from the National Geographic magazine, and yet I do not speak other language other than English. Moreover, the minority Spanish-speaking kids, quotes, from my school hang out together, speak Spanish, eat their own unique foods, are Catholic, and have their own customs. And here I am, looking at the mirror, desperately trying to bleach my skin. wanting to be taller, have different facial features to be just like them. Equality, destiny, why did you place me here? So, and then we have it in Spanish as well, you know, and this is kind of the format that we use to in our project. And by the way we have it also as part of our project, we have an ancillary website that contains the readings in English and Spanish for the individuals who want to have it and then maybe listen to it or just play it for maybe clients, you know, and see how they react as well. So some key questions, processing questions that we have. Number one, what is your intuitive or perhaps gut reaction? As you listen to the story, what is your quick gut reaction about the story? What kind of emotions, you know, this story will trigger? What are some of the overarching themes that you can extract from the story? And of course, you can dissect that. What are some of the issues that the main character is struggling with? Number four, if you were in the position of the main character, how would you handle these issues? And then that obligates the reader to position himself or herself within the story and then kind of feel those experiences, those feelings, those thoughts, you know, and be part of that story. What are some of the systemic and institutional issues that are manufacturing some of these issues? And this is what Dr. Pelc was referring to about those systemic issues that are, you know, pretty prevalent in our society, from racism to social injustice and oppression, among others. How would you help the main character or individuals who are struggling with similar issues? So these kind of questions allow the reader to reposition themselves within the story, try to find solutions, and then kind of get into the action mode, so to speak. So we wanted to integrate that piece of culture, the social issues, potential political issues as well, you know, in terms of oppression and social injustice, institutional racism, colorism, and whatnot, and then help the client, you know, try to find a solution within the story as well. Dr. Pelc, any thoughts? And I'm not sure if Dr. Pelc, I'll make sure that I'm not froze up or she's not froze up, or it's me.
I believe it is.
I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, you can hear me? Okay, so probably it's on Dr. Pelc's end?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So I'm trying to scroll down here. Cannot do it. She has control of the PowerPoint. Let's see. I can do anything on my end. Okay, now she's scrolling down. If you can hear me, Dr. Pelc. If you can scroll down all the way, maybe to the quotes as well. All right. Let's see. Having a kind of a dark space here as well. Not see much.
Okay, I think I'm back. Did that work?
Okay, good.
Even the best laid plans, and my apologies. I figured I might as well just close out and come right back to it. So here we go. Thank you so much for your
Okay.
patience.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Absolutely. I'll get you back to where we were. So we had left off with the
Yeah.
quotes.
Yep. So probably you want to jump into the one of the quotes that we have.
Sure. Let's go ahead and do that. And
Thank you.
even with the best laid plans.
That's technology.
Yeah.
That's technology. All right. You want to use the quote this time? Thank you.
Sure. So that's a good example of a microfiction. And if you might be considering what kinds of reactions, if you're maybe answering these questions for yourself, we would invite you to keep doing that, because we're going to ask you to, if you might be willing, participate in the chat with us and share a couple of any reactions. And feel free to do that already if you so choose. Some of the quotes that we might utilize as well are things like, what a liberation to realize that the voice in my head is not who I am. Who am I then? The one who sees that. And then we have processing questions, things like, whose voice or voices are in your head? What messages and stories have you been told about yourself and identities? Expand here. Identify a moment when you heard a counter voice. What new stories and messages were planted, regardless of how small or large they've grown? Expand here. So the idea that these voices, that these messages could evolve over time in trying to foster the development of new voices, counter voices, voices that extract some of the harmful messages that we might internalize over time. And so as we might help somebody navigate through a conversation, to ask a question like, imagine you were to unearth a new voice, a voice that represents an image of you in your context, a voice that describes you and is aware of the setting, the time and plot of your story. How would this voice describe how your identity story unfolds? And similar to what Dr. Swazo has mentioned, it encourages, it requires that the reader then engage with the story, to consider how they might be able to reauthor, reconceptualize. And even if the context is the same, I don't have to take in all of these messages wholesale. I have the capacity to extract the pieces of me that are not represented, add new pieces of me, reclaim pieces of me that might be missing. So these are some examples of how we might help to navigate some of these stories. Gosh, now I find myself being worried that if I click again, it's going to go away. I think we're doing okay so far. So if you were thinking how you might place yourself within these stories, we would like to consider, if you might be willing to share again, feel free to share as much or as little as feels comfortable, any themes that emerge for you. If you would like to share with us in the chat, it can be one word, it can be multiple words, it can be full sentences. We would just invite you to share yourselves however feels comfortable for you. Maybe to help with some of this process, again, feel free to type as we speak. Feel free to share anything that jumps to mind for you. Specifically reflecting on themes that draw out messages around identities and intersections, that we hold multiple identities and that they intersect. Anything around worldview, something that has shaped how we view the world, how we interact, how we feel and respond to the world as a result. The systems in which we exist, the systems in which we have existed, our families have existed, our communities have existed. Values that we have cultivated and or adopted, internalized, and emotions that surface. And so considering any dimension of those themes can be helpful. Gina, thank you so much for being the first and for sharing of yourself with us. Shame, allowing feelings to fester. Absolutely, those are wonderful points. I hear perhaps in there, it could be off base, but silence, right? The idea that there are messages that are silenced. Assimilation, conflicting identities, absolutely. Thank you so much, Jocelyn. It's wonderful to see you in this space as well. Certainly.
And just to expand on what you said, Dr. Pelc, these, for example, these microfiction, I mean, it speaks to a lot of the members of the Latinx community at different levels that have been marginalized in many ways, right? And then, so that idea, and this is kind of a previews, you know, this presentation would be kind of a preview of my next presentation as a keynote on identity issues, among other things. But this is a critical piece of, you know, finding your space within a dominant culture that may devalue who you are historically. And, you know, in spite of the fact that, you know, it's a culture that has a long, you know, history in the Americas, right? And how, you know, these, you know, subcultures, so to speak, you know, in a negative way, have been devalued for centuries. Especially, you know, I think it's a difficult issue for, you know, young populations who are trying to find their place in a dominant culture, and in how to feel that they have value, so to speak. And so there's a lot of emotions attached to it, you know, and also the concept of re-empowering individuals to really embrace their culture of origin, and how to create in a systemic and systematic way, find, I guess, strategies to navigate both cultures and value the power of being bilingual, multilingual, bicultural, and all that, as opposed to feel ashamed by it. And just to kind of reinforce, you know, the theme of this particular microfiction. Actually, that microfiction, when we wrote it, actually came as a result of a case that I had some years ago, in which I had a student who was an 8th grader who would used to walk with her mother to the school. And then there was a point that he told the mother not to walk with him. And I think they stopped around 6th grade or 7th grade. And the mother asked, you know, what's the reason? And he didn't want to say until one day he shared. And he said, I feel ashamed of you walking with me, because, you know, you come to the school, you're speaking in Spanish, you don't know English, my friends will see you, you dress a little bit different from the others, and also you give me a kiss in front of everyone, among other things. So this student in particular was of Guatemalan origin, and the mother was of native origin and still dressing, you know, with her typical dress from Guatemala. And so this student was struggling from an identity development standpoint with his own culture, the value of the culture. He didn't, at some point, he didn't want to speak Spanish anymore at home. So it was quite powerful to have him, then to bring other students who went through that process. And then we created groups so that he could actually see others who surpassed that stage, so to speak, and then reconquered what was lost. So in many ways, many of these stories, you know, talk about those issues of identity, you know, and positioning ourselves within a culture when it's distinctively different from the mainstream as well. Any thoughts, Dr. Pelc?
Yes, I so appreciate you sharing that story because, and I asked for permission from the student. So we had students from the university who are native Spanish speakers to help record these stories so that we could share them clinicians, educators who say, I don't speak Spanish, but I would love for folks to hear it in a native language. And so I asked Claudia if I could share this example, and she shared that she would be happy to for me to do so. That when she was recording a story about a cloak that essentially turned colors depending on the emotions of the person, it became heavier, that it was an external representation of what they felt inside. And we asked the students to express emotion as they read it, to try to picture themselves as these characters. And she said, I did not expect to feel anything. I expected to read the script. And what she said was, lo sentí mucho. I felt it deeply. And I found myself tearing up and crying and having to come back and reread it. And what I realized was this story is pertinent to me now. When I was back home from where she immigrated, I would not have felt this way. The story would not have spoken to me in the same way that it does now, today, here. And there's a moment where she said, there are moments I want to scream and I want to yell. And I don't think I'm allowed to as a woman, as an Indigenous woman here in this Midwestern institution. Pero lo sentí mucho. I felt it very deeply. And it was so moving to see her say, I thought this was an exercise and I appreciate being a part of this. And yet, as I was reading just for this purpose, I found myself being moved by the story. So I think it can be, in many ways, there can be ways for folks to step into the stories to feel, if allowed to, that there are lots of ways we can connect with these stories. So we saw the 5-minute marker, which is so helpful for us. Thank you for sharing that with us. We can kind of move briefly through this next part, and certainly we would love to be in contact with anyone. We would love to be able to follow up with you externally in the chat. But as you're thinking about these interventions, part of what we have conceptualized and how we use our work and the ways that we do this is to consider any kind of a theme and intention, so something around forgiveness or trust, or specifically maybe systemic trust. I don't trust these systems because they have harmed me. They have harmed my people in the past. They've harmed groups in which I exist. Offering the quote or a saying, so identifying a theme that is related to the goal. And in the book, we have them organized that way, and some of them overlap. And so we have some recommendations around where to look next if that's something that you're interested in. And then encourage clients or supervisees or students or group members to sit with it, to utilize the follow-up questions or activities. And some of them are movement, some of them are art, things that move beyond language. Things that move into the body, which allows us to step into different cultural spaces as well. And to allow it to kind of move from there, to use those as a starting point, to ask the client or members, what other questions would you ask? What was not included here? And so if we can think about windows of opportunities, that in those conversations, they might offer us windows to critically examine harmful internalized messages. Ways that we can use these tools to further deepen exploration, or how we might modify. So certainly some considerations that the group might make. I'm realizing, Dr. Swazo, I stepped on your slide. That I think that one was yours.
No, you're good. You're good. Okay. So yeah, you can close it if you want to.
Okay. And so when we're thinking about additional considerations, that perhaps it could be multiple languages, that there are tools to utilize translation for folks who may be multilingual, who might be able to read the same story or the same quote and feel it differently based on what emotion the language draws. And what we share here at the bottom is it is less important for us necessarily to be bilingual or multilingual, but rather the capacity to help deepen affect and to help the client speak in ways that are meaningful for them. So even when we do speak the same language, the experiences are different. So there's less emphasis necessarily on the language, but rather the language as a vehicle to accessing emotion and stories, consciousness raising activities. So we would love to open up to you. We know that folks have to transition. Dr. Swazo, I know you have to transition as well to get to your next session, but certainly I'm happy to open it up to the group.
Thank you, everyone. And I think we need to close here. We appreciate your time and it was wonderful.